I want to welcome you all to our webinar today on preparing for automated vehicles in rural America. My name is Mike Centetos. I'm the Policy Director for the National Center for Sustainable Transportation, and I'll be moderating the webinar today. Before we get started, I want to do just a quick introduction. This is part of our monthly-ish webinar series that we sponsor at the National Center for Sustainable Transportation. NCST is part of the University Transportation Center's program administered by the U.S. Department of Transportation. We're a consortium of 6 universities from around the country, including University of Vermont and UC Davis, as well as University of Southern California, Georgia Tech, UC Riverside, and CSU Long Beach. We're focused on advancing environmentally sustainable transportation through cutting-edge research, direct policy engagement, and education of our future leaders. Today's webinar is going to last for 1 hour. We'll have a presentation from Dr. Lisa Aultman-Hall of the University of Waterloo, and that's going to be followed by some remarks from 2 guest respondents, Joe Segali of the Vermont Agency of Transportation and Molly D'Agostino of UC Davis. And then after those responses, we'll open it up to Q&A for the last portion of the webinar. You can use the Q&A feature in the Zoom webinar platform at the bottom of your screen to type in your questions. You can do that at any time during the presentation, and we'll do our best to answer all of them. And we will be recording the webinar, and the recording and the slides will be available on our website in the coming days. So with that, let's jump into our presentation. I'm very happy to introduce Dr. Lisa Aultman-Hall, who is a professor and chair of systems design engineering at the University of Waterloo in Ontario, Canada. Before that, she served as the founding director of the Vermont Transportation Research Center at the University of Vermont, and associate director of our National Center for Sustainable Transportation. And she was part of a research team that sought to understand the benefits that vehicle automation might bring to rural areas, and how certain policies to improve the sustainability of automated vehicles might play out in a rural context. So Lisa, thank you so much for joining us, and I will turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Mike. And thank you to the NCST for producing these webinars and for hosting me. And thank you to Molly and Joe for joining me as discussants. I'm quite amused to see their dueling backgrounds, beautiful Vermont with beautiful California. And I miss both of those landscapes here in Waterloo, Ontario. For those of you who don't know where Waterloo, Ontario is, I really can't compete with those 2 backgrounds, but it really is a wonderful university. Why are my slides not going ahead? One sec. There we go. I did do this work while I was a professor at the University of Vermont. It's really kind of fun that Vermont is sort of the small state, the northern state, the eastern state, the rural state complement or representative in this quite great consortium of universities that make up this national UTC led by UC Davis. And I'm so glad, of course, that Joe from Vermont is here today. I also need to acknowledge my collaborators on this project. The vast majority of this work was led and conducted by Jonathan Dowds. He was at the Transportation Research Center at the University of Vermont. He did many NCST projects in the decade that he was there, and he's moved on now to a policy and even advocacy job in the capital of Vermont, Montpelier. And so I'm presenting with his blessing, of course. And then Jim Sullivan and Greg Rowengould, both at the TRC at the University of Vermont, were really important to contributing to this project, because in essence, what this research project was this giant literature review of automated vehicle stuff, modeling, analysis, simulation, policy, and the majority of it was urban focused, simulations in, modeling in Austin, Texas. And so what we were looking at, and our collaborators at the Vermont Agency of Transportation, including Joe, helped us with that, was sort of looking at the research that was out there in the literature about 2 years ago. This was completed before COVID, and sort of saying, well, does that make sense? Is that going to be true in rural communities? And that's what I'll be sharing with you here today. And so all of the people that contributed share in some of the ideas. Of course, it's always smart when you're going to talk about rural America or rural anywhere to acknowledge at the beginning of your presentation that there is no single type of rural. There's different levels of population, different development densities, they have different landscapes, infrastructure is built up differently, designed differently, there's different transportation challenges. In general, in America, the populations in the rural areas tend to be older and poorer and have higher rates of disability than the population at large. That has particular relevance to automated vehicles. The landscape in rural areas, by definition, what makes it rural is that origins and destinations are further apart. And that turns into longer trip distances and higher rates of automobile usage, lower rates of transit use, indeed many, many challenges in operating, designing viable transit or cost-effective transit. And of course, there's less walking and biking. So the types of options that are available more easily in urban areas are simply not there in rural areas. And some of the data shows us that there's fewer trips and longer trips by rural residents than urban residents, but that doesn't always bear out. That's not a really strong trend in the data. And often what rural residents have is reduced access to healthcare, grocery stores, and other essential destinations. And that's what rural transportation planning turns into, is providing this important or essential access to these more remote residents. And of course, that has been a real challenge, long-standing challenges, hard to overcome, and automated vehicles offer a chance to overcome some of those long-standing challenges. So today I'm just going to summarize the research report. It's available online, of course, like all other NCST reports, and basically compare the relative benefits of AVs in rural versus urban areas. And one of the core ways that we came to think about this as we were reviewing the research of others was that we should separate out the benefits of automation, the actual changes, the different vehicle, from the benefits of sharing those vehicles, sort of the system level elements of the future transportation system we imagine. There's the automating of the vehicle, which leads to certain benefits, and then the systems that we create with those vehicles, with pricing schemes, where we put different charging stations, fleets, how we share them, how we either share rides or share vehicles, the shared ownership models. And that leads to policy considerations in different policies in rural areas. And indeed, we started this research project because we were worrying about the three revolutions, the idea of this sharing being the way that automated vehicles were going to work so well in urban areas. And we started thinking, wait a minute, we can't just pick up that urban plan and drop it into a rural community and have it work. What does it mean, and how do we start getting more people talking about the fact that the visioning needed to be different in rural areas? And indeed, Molly and Joe will go second and share their vision for how automated vehicles will play out in rural areas. So one of the first things I would encourage you to think about is this idea of, well, what is rural VMT? So if you're here at this webinar, you're probably interested in automated vehicles, and you know that sort of hell scenario that people talk about, where there's all this extra VMT leading to congestion, leading to more energy use and emissions, and modeled in mostly urban areas. That's what the research has been. And so what about vehicle miles of travel in rural areas? Close to a fifth of the population lives in rural areas in the US, and a third of the VMT is incurred there. But we have to think about two different types of rural VMT. I think automatically we all think, oh, rural VMT is those people who live in rural areas taking their daily trips and getting their daily needs met. But that is not necessarily the majority component of rural VMT. In fact, long distance and intercity trips that may be going from one urban area to another urban area are incurring rural VMT. And in the case of this particular project, I want you to think about that long distance travel and what we have to do to appropriately deploy automated vehicles in that long distance travel system, where they're competing with airplanes and competing with trains. Maybe even those automated vehicles are becoming robo-coaches that are serving that intercity need. But we were focused mainly on those daily needs of rural residents in rural communities. So it's not particularly a new thing to be talking about automated vehicles. The sort of idea or the fantasy has been there a very long time. And I think that it's really just in the last 10 years that that fantasy became much more real. And at the 1950s sort of visioning, the idea was that we were going to implement infrastructure in our roadways, and that would allow the vehicles to drive themselves, the driverless car. And when you think about it, it becomes highly unlikely that we would actually instrument 4.1 million miles of public roads in America, right? We're not going to do that. But when we think about planning for automated vehicles in rural areas, we do have to think about the infrastructure and the instrumentation and what it means, because the vehicles may well be the same. They might have different operating modes in remote rural operation, but there are elements of that connected and autonomous vehicle, the infrastructure communication, the vehicle communication that may not work in rural areas. And in particular, I think the idea of any instrumentation or any technological elements of our infrastructure, we're going to have a hard time implementing it along the whole system in rural America. So that piece of it might not be there for us. So I like to say there's sort of three reasons why we've been obsessed with automated vehicles over the last 10 years. And the first reason is this convergence of technology. GPS allows the vehicle to know where it is. Sensors allow the vehicle to know what it is doing. And LiDAR and other technologies allow the vehicle to know what is around it. And when those three things sort of converged and were sort of feasibly available, automated vehicles started becoming a lot more viable. And so we have to think about that carefully for the application in rural areas, because GPS is certainly available globally, but the systems for mapping surroundings that we plop a GPS point down into are not necessarily as well developed or as detailed in rural versus urban areas. So there's going to be a difference there. Second, the cellular data that we might use to get that map information to the vehicle, to manage the sharing systems or the routing systems that the vehicle is using, it might not be there in many rural areas. And we're seeking to improve that, but we're not there yet. And it calls to question whether or not there needs to be this ability for the automated vehicles to do true remote operation and what it means. And is that going to be for transition years, or is it going to be a plan we have in the system long term? And then finally, as you know, the way that we imagine passenger transportation going is very much that we need to electrify the system. But we also have to sort of say to ourselves, is the electric infrastructure there, the electricity infrastructure, the power grid, is it developed at the level that we need it to be in rural areas to fuel automated vehicles when they're electric, and indeed to fuel any vehicles. The infrastructure, the electric infrastructure, tends to be older. It has capacity problems, and it's not necessarily ready to charge a whole bunch of vehicles at one time. And indeed, there's places in rural areas, even in California, Molly can correct me if I'm wrong, where we may not have that electric service to be able to charge the electric vehicles. And we need to be thinking about the electricity grid at the same time we're thinking about automated vehicles and electric vehicles in rural America. The second reason we've become so realistically talking about automated vehicles is that the societal market changes have happened in the last few years that make it real to seem that we're going to go this way. Consumer acceptance, more and more people are willing to get in these cars with every survey we do. Transportation network companies like Uber and Lyft has sort of shown us a new way to think about transportation, predominantly in urban areas. The public sector has implemented policies nearly in all 50 states. They're limited policies to start, allowing testing, addressing liability, allowing deployment. What's the right federal versus state role? How will we allow for truck platooning? Every state has maybe done a little bit of a different combination, and they know there's much more work to do. I think we feel a little bit calmer now that we have some time than we might have felt 5 years ago, but we still are going to need to start moving towards those policies that are going to set pricing and set allowable ways to operate the system, and hopefully optimal ways in the sense of sustainability, quality of life, the environment, optimal ways for automated vehicles to improve our overall transportation system. And of course, we know that industry is pushing the development of these more advanced vehicles. I think I would argue that 3 of these 4 things are simply true in rural areas and urban areas. And the one place that we know we need to do some very specific creative rural thinking is, what is a rural viable T&C service model? I think we know that it's not going to be the same as an urban area, but I think we haven't really got the details on exactly how that's going to work. And that's the sort of thing I'd like you to think about as I go through the literature summary here. Finally, a lot of reason that we talk about automated vehicles is I think that we sort of have this idea that they're going to save us. They're going to sort of improve safety. And safety is something that we all want in the transportation system. So it's not really a reason for thinking about automated vehicles that anybody can argue against, right? 90% of fatalities are due to human factors, as opposed to the roads that we've re-engineered, the vehicles that we've engineered to be so safe. And so things like impaired driving, speeding, red light running, those are human factors that contribute to crashes, injury and fatal crashes. And the rate of those crashes is so much higher in rural America. And so this says to us right away, oh, we can't say that we don't want automated vehicles in rural America, because this sort of #1 transportation planning thing, safety, that we've been worried about in rural areas, the automated vehicle offers us that benefit, and we need to find a way to use it, if we can, sustainably. So this gets us to this idea of 2 types of benefits from automated vehicles, and dividing into those 2 so we can think about the target area of rural communities. So there's the benefits from the automation of the vehicle itself. And we get the benefits of safety, mobility and accessibility, and traffic operations and energy efficiency. So again, these are the sort of benefits of automation that we drew from mostly urban focused literature on automated vehicles. And we have to sort of say to ourselves, are these going to accrue for rural areas? And I don't think I have to make much of an argument that overall the potential safety benefits of automated vehicles in rural areas are extremely important. And that's going to accrue whether or not we have shared or private ownership models for AV fleets. We could potentially get this safety benefit. When it comes to mobility and accessibility, that extra mobility from automated vehicles is going to come from different sources, different mechanisms operating in the overall system. We're going to have the people who cannot drive at this time or have limited driving ability. Maybe they don't drive at night. Maybe they don't own their own car, and maybe there's a shared system, and those people are going to have more mobility and more access in theory because of automated vehicles. But of course, then there's also going to be the lower travel burden. The cost of the travel time is not going to be as high. So we can imagine with longer rural trips that this particular mechanism is going to add to mobility and accessibility. People are going to be able to get places at a rural distance that they maybe can't in the current system. And related to that, the whole idea of, well, I can't go run that errand because it's so far from my rural home. Well, with an automated vehicle, you could send the vehicle on that errand. So all of this is going to give increased access to rural residents, rural communities. And so you would have to argue that the potential mobility benefits of AVs are going to be substantial in rural areas. And when I say that, I think that we can say it's going to mean more in rural areas, because in urban areas, you have these modal options. You might even be able to walk to have access to this thing that your car can go do for you on an unoccupied errand. But in rural areas, it's giving you access that you may not have in any way, any realistic way today. Now, the literature on the traffic operations and energy efficiency is a little bit contradictory related to automated vehicles. I mean, there's the idea that automated vehicles are going to optimize eco-driving. So you can think of that as, you know, automated vehicles are not going to do hard accelerations, which are a high emitting event. They're going to maybe follow at closer distances so we can have smoother traffic flows, and we're going to increase lane capacity and have a reduction in congestion. There's actually people who argue that there's places in the system where we could get a reduction in congestion, even though others are arguing the increase in empty trips and other mechanisms are going to increase congestion, and the more trips and the longer trips. And then we may, because of the smoother traffic flow, be able to have increased speeds. And if we keep doing those increased speeds with internal combustion engines, then of course we're going to have more emissions, and we're going to have a counter benefit there. I think that these things are less important in rural areas, that reducing congestion is not on the top of the list of rural transportation planning problems. And so this whole idea of automated vehicles improving or worsening congestion, except for some pinch points, as my colleague Molly points out to me, in rural areas, we're really not, this is not an important type of automation benefit. So there's an irony for rural areas. These long-standing safety, mobility, and access issues that rural transportation planners have had so much trouble really implementing robust solutions for. The automated vehicle is sort of a disruptive change that may give them additional tools that they didn't have before. And that is really important. It makes automated vehicles important for rural America. And of course, we have to deal with this dark side. We know from the simulations and the modeling that has gone on in many jurisdictions that we're expecting these increases of vehicle miles traveled. I mean, you probably all have seen numbers, in some cases, like a doubling of vehicle miles traveled or more, right? Because of having the automated vehicles. And that comes with negative environmental outcomes, negative costs, and of course, all this congestion, which steamrolls into other problems. And so the solution we hear about most, and I think it's fair, this is Dan Sperling, our at UC Davis. I think he was one of the very first, if not the first, to coin the term 3 revolutions as a solution. And I would argue that the things we all commonly know as transportation folks about what 3 revolutions mean, that's an urban solution, and we need to adapt what that means in rural areas. And so for those of you who may not know, the research has pretty consistently shown that if you combine automation with electrification and the sharing of vehicles and the sharing of rides, we can have fewer vehicles that we need to serve in our transportation system, in our mobility system, and we can have fewer greenhouse gas emissions. And those are very, very good things. And so that's a way to sort of counter the hell scenario that we hear people talking about from the robot cars. There's many different ways to look at costs. And this is just a most recent one from the NCST. And if you want to look at the blue bar, this is generalized cost, but the blue bar is the sort of financial cost of that ride. And the smallest blue bar is when we have pooled automated vehicles. And so in order to get that cost savings, we also need to implement some version of 3 revolutions, which I would argue is really hard to do in the rural areas. So what's going on with increasing VMT, and what is the relative impact in rural areas compared to urban areas? So this idea of the elimination of driver burden, that's going to be important in urban travel. Sure, it's going to be way more important in rural travel, right? The lower value of travel time and the marginal cost of travel, way more important in the longer trips. Unoccupied errands, way more important in the rural areas. It's going to be a disproportionately larger increase of vehicle miles traveled. The same with unoccupied vehicle repositioning. If an automated vehicle were to deliver somebody far out in a rural area to their home, there's no chance really to get the backhaul, right? To fill that car up at a given time in a given place with someone else. So our ability to actually have the cars full as they're operating in multiple directions in the system we just can't do it in the rural areas. So we're going to have a disproportionately even larger increase in VMT with AVs in the rural areas. In terms of vehicle occupancy and trip chaining, we don't really know what would happen in the rural areas compared to urban areas. Could we create an app-based system, an optimization system, a scheduling system where we can get shared vehicles and trip chaining? Maybe, but I don't know that we can price it. And then there's this big indirect thing that COVID has made us think about even more, right? The ability of people to basically sprawl development further out into rural areas, creating even more rural travel. This could be a really large increase. So this increasing VMT that we've seen modeled in urban areas I would argue, again, just anecdotally, based on our discussions in this project, that relative increase could be even bigger in the rural areas, and therefore we have to address it. So we got this big increase of the VMT, but we can get these safety and accessibility benefits that we've had so much trouble providing for rural America. So we have vehicle automation benefits. What about the sharing benefits? Can we get those in rural America? And so some of the largest gains envisioned are dependent on this implementation of car sharing and ride sharing. And that requires proximate riders with common travel choices over both time and space. And we really can't have that in a significant way in rural areas. So it's going to be really hard to get that spatial and temporal coordination. Somebody's saying, please define VMT. I just happened to see the chat. Vehicle miles of travel. So if one vehicle goes 10 miles, that's 10 vehicle miles of travel. If two vehicles go 10 miles, it's 20 vehicle miles of travel. So if an automated vehicle or some other type of service may be driven by a human, takes a person 30 miles and delivers them to a destination, that was 30 vehicle miles of travel. If they come back empty, that was 60 vehicle miles of travel, but only 30 passenger miles of travel. I hope that helps, John. Type again if it doesn't. Why can't we share and coordinate these EVs in rural areas? I think we can think of it in three buckets. We can't get the cost savings because we can't have a large enough fleet to offer choice, to align rides, to service the fleets. We can't really provide first mile, last mile to transit because we don't necessarily have the transit system. The wait times are going to be large. We might not have the internet and broadband access to coordinate and drive the whole system. And we have to somehow get people from their home to the place where the fleet is stored. So there just become these practical things that are about time and space coordination, and not to mention that we would have a whole bunch of repositioning in a rural system, which is going to, have a lot more emissions per trip. So what would we like to do? The literature we looked for and couldn't really find in a big way is, it would be really wonderful to have the type of data and models for rural areas that we have for urban areas. But for the most part, statewide models that include rural areas are really urban, have more detail in the urban areas. And we couldn't come up with a lot of methods to actually model this rural system because we don't have the data to know what people would do, so we can test scenarios in a simulation of what they might do. So one of the recommendations in the report is that we need the data and models to really measure this impact, to be able to model the rural transportation and the AVs in that landscape. I went backwards. In summary, because I want to turn it over to my colleagues. I think that in doing this research project, we really reinforce for ourselves the following ideas: that AVs offer a really important new tool for solving rural public and private transportation projects, like a totally new thing available to us as we envision these future systems. But the first step in order to use that tool effectively is to recognize that it's going to be different. The behavioral and operational differences are going to be huge. And so therefore we need policies, including those involving pricing, that don't penalize rural residents for the same things that we might want to discourage in urban areas. Because if we do that, automated vehicles won't become part of the system and we won't get the mobility and safety benefits. So maybe we need to relax those policies that will induce rural VMT in order to get the rural access. But then, just to make matters worse, think again about my long distance travel comment at the beginning. You may not want the same policies for urban residents, rural residents, and just rural travelers, because if you relax the policies and costs for long distance travel, you're going to induce that longer trips, more trips, that you don't want for the urban residents bringing their vehicles into the rural areas. So the different distinct automated vehicle systems for rural areas, they have to be deliberately modeled. This is going to require data that we don't necessarily have. And I think it would be really wonderful for sort of the next research project to even more effectively argue to get this rural travel data so we can have rural models that are just more sophisticated than the ones we have now. Just knowing general travel rates and applying multipliers to them and knowing how many people don't own cars or can't drive and assuming that they do make average trip rates, that type of sort of aggregate upping of the trip rates is all we can do in the rural areas. And it's not really enough. We need to do some real, true, large area agent-based simulations to play out the scenarios and figure out how to really get all the access we can while minimizing all the negative externalities possible. So thank you very much. And I'll turn it back over to Mike.
Thank you so much, Lisa. And I wonder if, before we move to our guest respondents, if you could maybe answer just one quick question. What are we talking about when we're talking about rural areas? Do you have a specific kind of definition in mind, or are we just talking about anywhere outside of big cities, or how should our audience be thinking about that term?
I'm going to give my answer, and then I'm going to actually invite Molly to give an answer too, because I think she's thought much more about this than me. I tend to draw my boundary at the exurbs. So exurbs would be those homes in rural Vermont that are on the 10-acre lots, and the suburbs would be the subdivisions with 2-car garages out in front. I think that the urban policy and systems around automated vehicles and these new mobility systems are going to work until that suburban fringe. And then once you're truly in the exurbs, even though you might have a commuter shed that's going to urban areas for work, I think that we're going to need to have some sort of different service policy in those areas. Molly, can I pick on you?
I'm not sure if I would have a better, but hi, I'm Molly D'Agostino. I'm with the UC Davis, and yeah, my understanding is that there isn't a good definition of rural and suburban. I think suburban specifically is a challenging one because the lines of where suburban ends and rural begins are quite blurry, and it's hard to differentiate in a lot of ways. So it seems like the planning community has used sort of an eyeballing approach, right? Looking at a land use type based on the way the roads are laid out, and making an assessment on of that sort of region, of that area based on that assessment, right? Like if you look at a map of Livermore, California, there are parts of it that look very much suburban, right? Based on the way that the roads are laid out, and then some that look much more rural based on the way the roads are laid out. So it's hard to actually make a density like per persons per square mile definition. And my understanding is that census in the American Community Surveys don't have a good density equals rule, because that is hard to do. And especially when you compare the density of America to the density of other places in the world, what places we consider suburban or even urban are low density compared to a lot of places internationally, right? So it's hard to, so that's a long-winded answer, but Joe may have a better one.
We'll know it when we see it, maybe is the answer.
Well, I think that in some ways, Mike, it's sort of, there's the density, which gives us the length of trips between origins and destinations. And then there's the absolute level of population, which gives us the number of people we need to coordinate a mobility system across time. So there's the time and space coordination. And I will turn to Joe, because there's many small pockets in Vermont that are high density, what we would call small towns, where people do walk and bike, and they're delightful communities, but they don't have the absolute number of people in order to justify the shared fleet that we could reasonably afford to provide them with, because they can't be making trips 24 hours a day. There's only a certain total population. So you've got to meet the density requirement, and then you've got to meet the total population in order to make a viable system. And that's the exact reason why we need data and we need to do these simulation models so that we can figure out what those thresholds are.
Yeah, this is something. Hi, everybody. I'm Joe Sigali. I'm the Policy Planning and Research Director at the Vermont Agency of Transportation. And what is and is not rural is something that I struggle with a lot, because you could make the case that all of Vermont is rural. But as Lisa pointed out, we do have these compact mixed-use centers that, if you're actually in the middle of them, you really do feel like you're in an urban area. But technically they would probably be defined as rural. And so that's how I think about it. Maybe on a smaller scale, we break it out that way. And, it was a challenge. We were doing some work on looking at mileage-based user fees, and it's a big issue of, will rural drivers pay more than urban drivers? And I'm like, well, for focusing on Vermont, aren't we all kind of rural in the first place? And we all drive, even if you live in one of these small centers or in a small city, we still probably drive more than other places in the country. So that it was less about the distinction of urban and rural and more about income, depending on what question it is you're trying to answer. So I guess all of us agree it's hard to nail down a real specific definition.
Well, it's funny because we have people weighing in on the chat and Q&A, and with multiple definitions, and they don't all match. So I think that's a good example of how maybe there isn't a.
I appreciate Joe mentioning income though, Mike, because right in the very first slide, I mentioned that rural areas tend to be poorer. And so that's a factor.
So I've done a terrible job moderating, and I haven't even introduced our guest respondents, and I've forced them to introduce themselves. So maybe we've got lots of questions rolling in, and we'll get to some of those. But Joe, let me reintroduce you. You already introduced yourself, but Joe is the director of the Policy Planning and Research Bureau for the Vermont Agency of Transportation. And Joe, you've been engaged with the state of Vermont's kind of early efforts to plan for automated vehicles. I'm wondering if you could offer a few remarks on kind of what you've been working on and kind of where you see this research fitting in.
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks for inviting me to participate in this. It's fun to talk about these things and sort of, from a policy level. And I also really want to express my gratitude for the work that, Lisa and her team have done on this subject and on so many other subjects that are really helpful to us in Vermont. And our partnership with the University of Vermont is really important to us. And it's great that they can dive into these issues and kind of come back with what I think is a really well-written report, easy to understand. I can read it quickly and kind of get through it. But I have sort of 3 points hopefully I can make kind of quickly. One is that more VMT in rural areas isn't necessarily a bad thing. And second, I don't want to give up on the idea of shared mobility in rural areas. And finally, I think there's a need to do some actual testing of automated vehicles in rural areas that could maybe inform our policy decisions. And the reason I don't think VMT in rural areas is necessarily a bad thing. The first caveat, though, is that as long as it's electrified VMT, then I'm not worried about greenhouse gas emissions and other emissions, and also as long as it's automated, because that'll help mitigate the safety issues of more vehicle miles that travel. And I'm not. Well, there was a statement in the report that really kind of resonated with me, which is that VMT in rural areas might be an indication of well-being. So it means that there's sort of it's addressing a need for some pent-up travel, right? That can't happen right now because there's not enough other modes for people to travel and people are isolated. So if we see VMT go up, or to Lisa's earlier point, person miles of travel really, that are in automated vehicles, I see that as a good thing. That means that there's a need being satisfied, and that really is what the transportation system is all about. It doesn't exist for itself. Definitely not worried about congestion in rural areas. Yes, there's a few bottlenecks here or there. And if we have congestion problem, it's more special events, or if there's a ski area in town, that sort of thing. Like we're doing a study now to help Stowe Mountain Resort deal with some pretty severe congestion, but it's only like 8 days a year, and I think automated vehicles could help actually play a role. Connected and automated vehicles could probably play a role to help address some of those congestion issues in the long term. I don't want to give up on what shared mobility in rural areas. I just think it's going to look different. It's not going to be a private transportation network company. What I was excited about automated vehicles in Vermont was its ability to be part of a transit system and reduce the cost of providing transit service. In my work, we do a lot of public outreach in rural areas, and we hear it all the time. They want more public transit. And what they really want is, the mobility and access that provides. But it's just too darn expensive for us to provide it everywhere. And in Vermont, I'm pretty proud of the fact that we really do a great job with rural public transit, but we can't go everywhere. And I really feel like automated vehicles, this is the downside of automated vehicles is you don't need a driver. That is a lost job. That is a negative. But at the same time, it will reduce the cost of providing for rural transit. And where I live, I know I live in a rural area, despite the question of definition. You sort of know it when you see it. I could walk out my back door and go for miles and miles, and not have to cross a road. But my village is a mile down the road, and that's where I can pick up. There's a park and ride there, but there's no transit service. So I see automated vehicles potentially as providing for low-cost shuttles that is a public model, not a private model, because public transit is not going to go away. It's not going to be replaced by these private companies completely. And then finally, I think the report kind of landed on this idea of needing to do stated preference surveys because there's not lots of other great options right now, and understanding how rural folks are going to respond to automated vehicles. And, but the downside of stated preference is the people responding need to have some experience, because they're sort of, they're kind of guessing how they're going to respond given certain scenarios. And to me, that's where testing can really kind of come in with automated vehicles. And we passed a law that I was involved with a couple of years ago, allowing testing of automated vehicles on our public roads. But to get a private company to come here, really hard. They have, they're focused on the big urban areas, and they have a mission of figuring out the technology challenges, and they may not, they could probably get a lot of the information they need without coming to these small areas, and the market may not be here. So when the market isn't going to, come and do what it needs to do, that's when the public sector really should be stepping in. And, we passed this testing law, and I really, it's been on my to-do list to sort of lead an effort to try to get some testing in Vermont. And just like, an example, it's an urban area, but it was a DOT-led testing down in Providence, Rhode Island, that connected a neighborhood that was redeveloping to downtown Providence. And that was an Agency of Transportation initiative. So so I'm excited about this. Thanks for the great work. And those are my 3 main comments. Looking forward to the rest of the discussion.
Thank you so much, Joe. Questions and chats are continuing to roll in, I think seconding a lot of what you just spoke to. I want to turn now to our final guest respondent, Molly D'Agostino. Molly, thank you as well for joining. Molly is the policy director at the UC Davis Policy Institute for Energy, Environment, and the Economy. And she's been doing a lot of work on these 3 revolutions in transportation: sharing, electrification, and automation. So Molly, would love to hear your thoughts as well.
Thanks so much, Mike, and Lisa, great presentation. And I'm learning so much from everything you're saying, Joe. So I'll just really agree with a lot of what you're saying. I think what I think when we think about rural living, right? When we think about the ability to live somewhere rural, really, it's a lot of the conversation is about trade-offs, right? Where the typical frame is that you choose to live in a rural place because you're choosing to opt to pay less for transportation, it's less for housing and more for transportation, right? That's the sort of very simplistic frame that you do pay more for transportation, especially in the terms of your time that you're willing to travel between the places, the destinations you would go to day to day. But your housing costs are going to be a lot less, and you get other benefits that you can't appreciate in an urban place that matter to you, that you value, right? That's the sort of like trope around urban versus suburban versus rural living, right? Where people are taking that trade-offs and they're making their own decisions about where to live. Unfortunately, we know in practice, many are choosing to live in a rural area, and others are faced with less access because they do live in a rural area, and that they that this is not a trade-off that they're necessarily they're making, but more of a product of their reality, right? They live in a rural area, and as a result, they have less healthcare, less access. And so I think if we can envision automated vehicles as being part of improving access for rural residents, I think it's about trying to think more about those trade-offs and how we sort of develop a system in which that, they can still appreciate a lot of the benefits of rural living, but still mitigate some of those challenges, right? So mitigate some of those access challenges of getting to healthcare, getting to, and there's been some research done on this, and I just, UC Davis is leading work looking at mobility as a service in rural areas in the San Joaquin Valley. And so this is research being led by Caroline Rodier. And, the work they've done is working with the San Joaquin government San Joaquin Valley Council of Governments to do mobility as a service program that is publicly led. And this, is pretty, is becoming more common, right? There are publicly led mobility as a service. These are trip planning and payment apparatus. Usually they put them together, happening all over the world, but they tend to occur in urban places. So the question is, can mobility as a service work in rural areas? And Vamos is the name of the mobility as a service provider in San Joaquin Valley, is proving that it can be done, right? It can be done, but it like Joe mentioned and Lisa mentioned as well, it may require subsidy, right? There isn't, speaking to this sort of in the private interest investment in rural areas, there truly isn't as much density, so it's harder to make it pencil. And so yes, there might need to be subsidies, but I think that speaks to the larger issue, the larger reality of what rural living is, and the fact that transportation just costs more when you have to travel further to get to from point A to point B. And so we have to accept that there may be higher costs associated with providing mobility as a service in a rural place, but there are also more costs with driving, right? Just because you're putting more miles on the road. So I think that's my big what I'd like to share here. But I also think I think what we need to also look at is broadly this conversation around trade-offs is one where rural communities will have to navigate a number of unique challenges, and certainly the issue around cellular data and rural connectivity, and whether connected vehicles can even operate in rural areas, whether those investments will pencil, and whether a case can be made for public investment if the stakes are going to be so high and the costs are going to be so high. Those are questions that rural communities will have to face, and that may mean that there are really different transportation landscapes in rural and urban places. But our status quo shows us that is the case now, right? And the future will look, unfortunately, somewhat similar, but there's going to be new opportunities for rural places, just like there are new opportunities for urban places, but it's never going to look the same. And so I think that's my biggest takeaway when thinking about the three revolutions in rural areas. And I think, it's not going to look the same as in downtown San Francisco, but look, San Francisco does not look the same as Yosemite, and we like it that way, right? And so I think I'll end there.
Great, thank you so much, Molly, and thanks to all three of you for offering those remarks. Plenty of questions coming in, so we'll see how many we can get to here in the last 10 minutes. I'll start with maybe a question that Lisa, you can start with, and Molly and Joe, I'd invite you to weigh in as well. I think several of you commented, and the commenter also pointed out that, in the quote unquote rural areas, there are plenty of smaller towns that are densely populated enough to support walking and bicycling, active transportation. Do any of you have thoughts or concerns about the degree to which vehicle automation could, kind of by making vehicle travel easier, reduce some of those other modes like walking and bicycling in the smaller towns where that is a viable transportation means?
I don't, because I think, the walking and biking that are happening in rural communities are happening in a pretty concentrated place. And since we're a little bit spread out anyway, I think that automated vehicles will take care of the longer trips, and walking and biking will still remain, preferred modes of travel, for areas where things are close enough to each other. That's really their competitive advantage. And I don't think automated, talking like, again, the Vermont experience, our villages might be a half mile in diameter, if that. And I just don't see an automated vehicle being competitive in that sort of, environment.
I do worry about it, Mike, for long distance travel. I well, I don't know that I worry about it. I think I'm excited about it because I think that in the long distance travel landscape, we're probably going to make, I hope, deliberate and efficient choices of where we fly and move travel to electrified ground vehicles for the kind of for the San Francisco, LA, or the Burlington, Vermont, New York trip range. So I think that there's going to be some good increase in use of vehicles, and that includes people who don't have access and mobility now who will be able to have it. But in terms of the walking and biking, I think the people who choose to do that are not necessarily going to switch to cars. I don't see a big mode switch down there. I mean, we do have to pay attention to it, but I think we can be encouraged by decades of knowing that pricing of parking influences mode choice in those dense urban areas. The availability and the pricing of parking really can influence people to walk and bike versus drive. And I think that will be still true. And it kind of gives us a little bit of incentive and maybe encouragement to get the pricing of mobility services right, because that pricing of parking and the way it can be used to get the outcome you want in the system encourages us to think, wow, if we price these mobilities as a service right, we as planners are finally going to be able to optimize the overall system. And that's a really good thing. And there's lots of walkers and bikers in that system.
Great. We got a couple of questions asking about if anyone's aware of pilot projects of rural automation. I'll just note that a number of people have actually answered that question in the Q&A already. So folks mentioned that USDOT has funded a couple pilot projects for automated driving systems in Iowa and Ohio. And then someone else included a link for the National Park Service piloting an automated shuttle. So I'd encourage folks to scroll through the Q&A for some of those links. Joe, maybe I could direct, we got a couple of questions that maybe you could start us off on. Folks noting that vehicle automation may actually be a better fit, at least initially, in the trucking sector and goods movement. But I'm wondering if in the state of Vermont, you all have had any discussions about vehicle automation kind of serving, either delivering goods to or from rural areas, and the extent to which you've kind of distinguished between the logistics and passenger travel.
Yeah, I guess we haven't gone down to that level. I am working with the other states in New England, or we've been working on this. It's another research project looking at how we can harmonize our laws across state lines to facilitate the deployment of automated vehicles. And commercial trucking has come up, and really it's at least it's not really just a single state issue. If there's going to be automated trucks, and they're out there now, right? There's some pilots that I think are running like between Arizona and California, and UPS might be doing some things. And so I think it's a real, we may see that technology before we see it, among the general public. I think it's a big opportunity for us to maybe guide trucks on routes where we think we want them to go. We're doing it's called a planning and environment linkages study, looking at one of our small cities, Virgins, which has a state highway that goes right through the middle of it. It's a big trucking route. For us, it's a lot of trucks, 800 trucks a day through this really nice little downtown. It's having real negative consequences on their ability to grow and be vital. And I've been thinking, with automated trucking, that might be a long-term alternative to get those vehicles off of that particular route, particularly if they're platooning, right? Because we probably wouldn't be too supportive of platooning of trucks on our 2-lane rural roads, and we want to encourage them to go onto the national highway system and our interstate routes, which would get them out of Virgins, and it still may be more cost effective, because that's what's driving the route selection for the truckers. If they can platoon their trucks but still have to maybe drive a little bit further, I know it's more VMT, but be on these major routes. And so I think there's lots of opportunities, but we haven't done much strategizing on how to facilitate that yet.
Lisa or Molly, anything you wanted to add on that question?
On the question of freight, so specifically, yeah, so there's a lot of UC Davis research on freight automation. So I'm happy to share some resources after. But I think I'll just mention that, I think there's automation may allow folks to think, to sort of think about freight differently, and dividing the long haul, the middle mile, as it's sometimes called, and the last mile, where the middle mile may require different types of tech to automate than the last mile, and that may end up meaning different. So it will change the way that that freight is. It may have pretty large scale impacts over time, but this is not likely to happen overnight, right? There was a study put out by the USDOT that said freight automation is not happening. It's not going to be the blink of an eye. It's going to be a slow, introduction of different types of technology, testing, seeing what works for different sectors. And so I think that, so it'll be really interesting to see how rural communities will be impacted if it does mean that middle mile truck is parked on the freeway off ramp, and then a local community member can get the job to move that truck to its next point where it can't be operated autonomously. That could be an interesting opportunity. So we'll see, I guess, is the answer there.
Thanks. We got a question, Lisa, asking about data sources for some of the information you talked about in terms of safety in rural versus urban areas and crash and fatality numbers. I'm thinking maybe we can, if you have a reference, we could just add to the PowerPoint and post an updated version.
Yeah, and all of the data in the PowerPoint is the same as it was in the report. So the reference list in the report is accurate for the PowerPoint.
Great. So we'll point folks to the report for that. I also got a comment that folks can't see everything that's happening in the chat. The references that I noted that people have mentioned were provided in the Q&A, which I believe everyone should be able to see. So scroll there. Just in our last 2 minutes here, wanted to ask one last question for all of you. Maybe Lisa, you can kick off, and Molly and Joe would love to get your thoughts too. So Lisa, you talked about how in rural areas tend to be lower income. And so there's a question about what automated vehicles mean for travelers with lower incomes, and whether this is going to be a new technology that is going to be inaccessible to that may cost more, or whether it may actually provide some more opportunities for low-income travelers that maybe owning a car is infeasible, or keeping it maintained is difficult. So we'd love all of your thoughts on what you think AVs might mean for lower-income travelers, specifically in rural areas.
Yeah, I love the piece of the research that shows that we're going to need a total fewer number of vehicles to serve mobility in our communities because of automated vehicles. And I think that's important related to the cost. So sometimes I get kind of depressed by the cost of a vehicle already. I think maybe we all do. And I mean, we hear all this talk about gasoline prices. Oh no, it's so high. And it's like all those other costs that are, invisible to us of owning a car. Why don't we talk about that at dinner every night? Cars are really, really expensive, high technology. And it's wonderful that we have them. But do we really each all need one? And I think what the shared mobility scenarios and the modeling those are showing us is that we could really lower the cost for all of us, regardless of our income, by sharing the advanced technology. And the technology we have in our phones can help us do that coordination. And we've seen it in so many sectors now. And so I have, I guess, the answer is converted in the last 5 years, Mike, to seeing some of this vehicle technology. I'm a big cyclist. I'm sort of like, go with the low tech when you can. But some of this technology is potentially going to reduce the cost for everyone. And I think that's important because we have built a landscape in America that it's built for the automobile. So we're going to have a form of the automobile continue to move us around that for quite a while.
I don't know if we're over time or not.
Quick answer, 30 seconds.
Quick answer. Yeah, I think the potential cost savings are huge. I saw one study where it could be as much as $10,000 a year per household. I mean, that's a lot of money for almost all of us, right? That makes a real difference in people's lives. The other quick point I'll make is we haven't talked about the land use implications of this. I think if it's easier to travel, it means more people. Actually, people like to live out in rural areas. It's not just because houses cost less. I mean, it's a lifestyle choice. And so, I think we could see just more pressure for sprawl.
That is a great point. And I'm sure Lisa and Molly would have lots to comment on that, but we're out of time. Molly, do you have a
We're out of time,
5-second
yeah,
thought?
no problem.
Okay.
A 5-second thought is transit. Let's make transit, more feasible in rural places. And I think that automation could potentially reduce costs of service provision and make it possible to provide more transit, connecting communities within rural areas and between rural areas and, nearby centers. So yeah, I'll leave it there. But thank you so much for having me. And thank you so much, Lisa. This research was really interesting. And Joe and everyone. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thanks everyone for joining. I'll mention that I did drop a link in the chat to a survey. We'd love your thoughts on how we can do better on our next webinar. And yes, just echoing a huge thank you to Lisa for sharing this work with us, and Molly and Joe for offering your thoughts. And of course, to everyone who tuned in. And I know we didn't get to all the questions, but there are a couple that we may be able to follow up on afterwards, and keep an eye out for the slides and recording to be posted to that link that I provided in the chat. So thank you all so very much, and we'll let you get on with your day. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.